These 3 disturbing Thanksgiving horror stories are all inspired by shocking real events. First, a host discovers her husband is cheating and decides to serve her dinner guests something truly unspeakable. Next, a 13-year-old girl finds what she thinks is a gift on the front porch, but opening it unleashes an absolute nightmare on her entire family. And finally, a soldier sits through a peaceful Thanksgiving dinner. Right before he stands up, grabs a gun, and opens fire on his own blood relatives. Make sure you watch until the very end, because you're going to find out what happens when that soldier, the one they're all trying to welcome home from deployment, finally snaps and does the unthinkable to the people at that dinner table. This Israeli-born model wanted to cook the perfect Thanksgiving dinner for her guests. But the main course wasn't turkey, and her dinner guests had no idea they were about to eat something far more sinister. Her name was Mira, a 29-year-old Israeli-born model living in Washington state. She was a woman who survived on a diet of precision and control. Her life, like her beautiful, high-strung features, was something to be meticulously managed. And this Thanksgiving, November 25th, 1993, was meant to be the pinnacle of that control, a perfect, unforgettable meal. But the truth was, Mira had been living a lie. For weeks, perhaps months, the foundation of her perfect life had been cracking. Her husband, Alex, was the source. She knew he was up to something. The signs were all there, like small, dirty fingerprints on her clean reality. His routines were different. He was working late, but without the usual complaints, he was distant, his excuses vague and practiced. She couldn't pinpoint it, but she could feel it. A cold spot in the marriage. She had battled with the thought constantly. In the quiet moments while cleaning or preparing a meal, the question would surface. What if he's cheating? She would immediately push it back down. Alex had a lot of good things. He was a good provider. He could be charming. He's not really a bad guy, she would tell herself. Trying to rationalize the growing emptiness in their home, she was lying to herself. And she knew it, because the alternative was a loss of control she simply could not face. But just beneath that denial, a darker, more possessive thought would always follow, whispering from a cold part of her mind, "He better not be cheating on me." That was the battle raging inside her as Thanksgiving Day dawned. The morning was bright and unseasonably sunny in the Pacific Northwest, a detail that felt like a mockery. Her perfect life was a stage set, and she was an actress preparing for her most important performance. The first, fatal flaw in the day's script was waiting for her in the living room. It was her husband, Alex, asleep on the couch after another long night out. And that's when she saw it. It wasn't a suspicion this time. It wasn't a different routine or a vague feeling. Lying on the floor next to the couch, where it must have fallen from his pocket as he turned in his sleep, was a small piece of foil. It was the top portion of a ripped-off condom wrapper. It was a small, vulgar piece of trash, and it was cold, hard, undeniable evidence. In that single, silent instant, the lie she had been telling herself was incinerated. The high-strung, precise world she had desperately tried to maintain didn't just crack. It was shattered. She didn't scream. She didn't throw a lamp or demand an explanation. The control she craved simply shifted, like a train switching to a dark, hidden track. She broke. The violence that followed was immediate, desperate, and contained entirely within the 4 walls of their apartment. Mira walked to the kitchen, past the uncooked vegetables and the perfectly brined turkey. Her movements were calm, her purpose now horrifyingly clear. She found the longest kitchen knife she owned, its 10-inch blade professional grade, still sharp from her holiday prep. She walked back to the couch where Alex was still sleeping, and she stabbed him. She stabbed him a brutal 37 times. The act was quick, silent, and entirely overwhelming. The only sounds in the sunlit room were her own ragged breaths and the awful, wet work of the blade. The first thing to register, the first sensory detail to pierce her fractured mind, was the smell. A terrible, raw smell of fresh blood instantly filled the air. It was a thick, pungent odor, like a burst of sharp iron, that immediately mixed with the sweet, savory scent of the turkey she had already started preparing in the oven. The horror had already entered the food chain. Mira, now 29, faced a problem that dwarfed the affair: a body. Her guests were set to arrive in just a few hours. The absolute chaos she had just unleashed needed to be put back inside its box. She looked at the floor. The whole house was laminate, no carpet. That was a blessing. The laminate would be easy to clean. She went to the linen closet, her movements still mechanical, and pulled out 2 sheets and a thick blanket. She layered them on the floor beside the couch. With a strength she didn't know she had, she rolled Alex's body into the bundle, creating a thick shroud to contain the blood. She dragged the heavy bundle across the laminate floor, leaving no trail, and pulled it into the master bedroom. This would be the dedicated room she could lock the door, contain the mess to one single sealable space, and deal with the laminate floor in there later. She went back to the living room. She scrubbed the laminate floor where the first drops had fallen, erasing the stain. She then went through the apartment, opening the windows, letting the bright, unseasonably warm air flow through. She hoped the fresh air would carry away the lingering smell of sharp iron. She ripped the blood-soaked cushions from the couch, flipped them, and then, for good measure, covered the entire sofa with a large decorative sheet. It looked almost normal. Almost. She returned to the bedroom and locked the door from the inside. She retrieved the electric saw, a tool meant for home repair, and plugged it into the wall. Suddenly, the apartment was filled with a high-pitched, grinding whine. It was an unnatural, metallic shriek, a sound of metal on bone and tissue that was sickeningly final. There was no music playing to cover the noise. There was only the sound of the saw and her own frantic, shallow breaths contained within that single sealed room. The mess was horrifying, but it was all contained on the hard laminate, just as she had planned. She worked with a terrifying, panicked efficiency. She double-bagged the parts in thick black trash bags. As she worked, a new, fractured, and delusional state took over. She thought about the guests who would be arriving soon. They weren't her friends. They were his friends. A cold, vicious thought took root. They knew. They knew he was cheating, and they didn't tell me. She decided in that moment that they would be a part of this. She would feed them. She finished her task, hiding the double-bagged parts in various closets. She took a few pieces for the kitchen, and one last bag she carelessly tucked into the bathroom cabinet. She then sealed the bedroom, locking the door behind her. No one would go in there. The smell of iron and rot was now trapped, at least for a while. The party was not canceled. The ultimate violation was yet to come. As evening approached, the guests arrived one by one. Mira, the high-strung model and meticulous host, welcomed them in with a strained, practiced smile. She took their coats. She offered them drinks. The Thanksgiving table was set perfectly. The aroma of sage, butter, and cooked fowl was thick and inviting in the air, flowing in from the open windows, masking everything else. The locked bedroom door went unnoticed. The decorative sheet on the couch looked intentional. They sat down for the main course, the beautiful, golden brown turkey glistening on its platter. The human meat had been seamlessly integrated into the stuffing and gravy. The presentation was perfect. The guests began to eat. The atmosphere was convivial, the polite chatter of a holiday gathering filling the small apartment. The normal, happy sounds were a complete and horrifying contrast to the secret hidden in the meal. And no one noticed. The food, in its rich, complex holiday disguise, passed without comment. The evening wore on. The meal was finished. It was an hour later when one of the guests got up to use the bathroom. He was in there for a minute when he opened the small cabinet under the sink, perhaps looking for extra toilet paper. Tucked inside, he saw a black trash bag. It wasn't closed properly. It was just one bag, separate from the others. He could see a dark, wet stain at the bottom. Curious, he peeked in. He saw something that his mind couldn't immediately process. It wasn't until he saw the pale, distinct shape of a human hand that his brain finally caught up. The guest walked out of the bathroom, his face white, his body trembling. The polite chatter in the living room stopped. Everyone turned to look at him. He stared at Mira, who was smiling, holding a glass of wine. "Mira," he said, his voice shaking. "What's in the bag in the bathroom?" The apartment fell into a dead electric silence. Mira looked up, her smile not fading, but becoming something else, something cold and empty. There was no panic. There were no tears. There was only a profound, unnerving calm. She set her wine glass down. "I killed him," she said. The reaction was instant. It was a detonation of terror. Guests screamed. One person yelled, "Fuck this, I'm out!" People scrambled, knocking over chairs in a frantic rush for the front door. One of them ran to a neighbor's apartment and called the police. Mira was arrested shortly after, standing alone beside her perfect, ruined Thanksgiving table. The police arrived to find the horrifying tableau: the half-eaten plates, the locked bedroom door which they had to break down, and the gruesome scene on the laminate floor inside. They found the electric saw. They found the double-bagged parts in the closets. They confirmed the 37 stab wounds. In 1995, Mira was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 15 years in prison. In 2009, she was released. The facts of the case were meticulously recorded, but the full measure of the dread she created that day is immeasurable. The truth of this case is simple. Trust is the easiest thing to poison. You can share a holiday meal with a person you think you know, in a place you believe is safe, and never see the violence hidden just beneath the surface of the perfect host. Every time you smell turkey and spice, or sit down at a dinner table with a smiling host, you might just wonder, is the face of evil disarmingly ordinary? "14 family members gathered for what should have been a peaceful Thanksgiving dinner. But when the meal ended, one of them reached for a gun and opened fire on his own blood relatives, creating a massacre that would forever change the meaning of family gathering. It was Thanksgiving Day, 2007. Inside a small home in a quiet northeast Arkansas town, the air was a warm, golden cloud of comfort. It was a powerful, layered scent of roasted turkey, sweet spices, baking bread, and the faint, clean perfume of a pine centerpiece. The dinner table was a happy wreckage, a testament to a full meal shared by people who loved each other. Plates were pushed aside, glasses sat heavy, and the room was filled with the sounds of a family. The low, collective mumble of comfortable conversation, the bright, sudden peal of laughter, the gentle clink of silverware. This was the safe place. This was the core of their world. 14 members of the family were present. There was Wanda, the mother, bustling and tired but beaming with a deep maternal happiness. Her twin daughters, Mary Beth and Charlene, both 27, sat near each other, whispering and laughing as they always had. Charlene was 7 months pregnant, and her presence was a bright promise, an extra layer of joy and anticipation for the whole family. Their older cousin Frank, who was 30, was holding court, telling a loud, animated story to his cousin-in-law, Jerry, 33. And weaving between them all, a small blur of motion still wired from the sugar rush of dessert, was little 8-year-old Wayne. And then there was Gary. Gary was 33. He was Wanda's son, a brother, a cousin. He was one of them, but he was also separate. A former Army infantryman, he had seen multiple deployments and had only recently returned home. This Thanksgiving was, in many ways, for him. It was meant to be a celebration of his return, a loud, warm, loving event to fold him back into the safety of the family, to erase the hard lines the world had drawn on him. But the air around him felt wrong. It was a subtle, pressurized feeling, like a low hum you can't quite locate, or a window left open in a winter-cold room. He sat at the table, a pocket of absolute silence in the middle of the warmth. He wasn't really with them. He ate little, pushing the food around on his plate. He said less. His eyes were unfocused, and he seemed to be watching the mundane, loving movements of his family, the passing of a gravy boat, a shared whisper, the simple act of a sister leaning over to laugh, as if they were all engaged in a complex, silent threat that only he could see. His family, steeped in love, saw this not as a threat, but as a symptom. They tried to draw him in. Frank, boisterous and warm, slapped him on the back, a heavy, friendly gesture. "Good to have you home, man," he boomed, his voice full of genuine relief. "You missed this? I bet you missed this." Gary didn't flinch, but he didn't react either. He just turned his head slowly. His eyes were flat. "Yeah," he said. The word was empty, and the sound of it was so devoid of emotion that Frank's smile faltered. The joke, the warmth, all of it just died on contact. Frank cleared his throat and turned back to Jerry, the energy in that corner of the table suddenly, strangely muted. A moment later, Mary Beth tried. She saw him staring, his hands resting on the table. She slid the platter of turkey closer to him, a gentle, sisterly nudge. "Eat something, Gary," she said, her voice soft. "It's your favorite. Mom made it just for you." He looked at the plate, then at her, and for a half second, the family members watching saw a flicker of something. But it wasn't recognition. He looked at his twin sister, the woman he had grown up with, as if she were a stranger, a vaguely confusing and possibly untrustworthy person. He gave a single, short nod and looked away, his gaze returning to the middle distance. The wrongness was a pattern now. It was a palpable thing, a cold spot in the room. The final attempt came from the only one who didn't understand the new rules. Little Wayne, oblivious to the tension, ran up to his cousin, holding a new toy truck. "Look, Gary, look what I got. It's got real wheels." The boy held it up, his face bright with the pure, simple joy of a child. Gary turned and looked down. He didn't speak. He didn't smile. He just stared. He stared at the boy with such a profound, empty, and unnerving intensity that the 8-year-old's smile faltered. The boy's hand, holding the truck, slowly lowered. He felt the cold, too. He took a small step back, then another, before turning and quietly walking back to his mother's side. Now the whispers began among the adults. They were hushed, pained. "It's the PTSD," one would say to another. "He just needs time. He's just adjusting. He's seen so much." They were rationalizing the wrong details. They were making excuses for the man they loved, telling themselves that the old Gary was still in there, that he just needed to trust that this safe, ordinary world was still here, that he was finally, truly home. They were isolating themselves from the terrifying emerging truth because it was simply too terrible to accept. It was just after 6 p.m. The meal was over. The work of clearing the table had begun. A sense of false relief settled over the room. The difficult part, the dinner, the forced attempts at conversation, was over. The rhythm of plates being scraped and stacked, the sound of water running in the kitchen, the familiar clinking of glass. It was the sound of everything being normal again, of a holiday winding down in peace. Then Gary rose from his chair. He made almost no noise doing it. He didn't clear his throat or excuse himself. He simply stood and moved, with a kind of practiced economic motion that only military training can instill. He walked away from the table, not toward the kitchen, but toward a closet in the hall. The family members who noticed him paused, their hands hovering over plates. They watched him reach inside the closet. They watched him pull out a handgun. The moment hung suspended in a kind of pure, blinding absurdity. The human mind cannot make such a leap. It cannot go from the scent of pine and turkey to this it scrambles, desperate for another answer. Frank, the older cousin, was the first to react. He let out that same short, startled burst of air from before, but this time it was high-pitched, a nervous laugh. "Hey, what is this, man? Cut it out!" A few others glanced at each other, their faces a canvas of profound confusion, not yet terror. Their brains were searching desperately for a logical context. It had to be a prank, a terrible, tasteless joke. Maybe it was a firecracker, and the sound of it outside had just been perfectly timed. The idea that this was real, that the man they had welcomed home was holding a weapon with murderous intent, was a concept too heavy, too alien for their minds to hold. But Gary's expression held no humor, no recognition. His eyes were hard, distant. He was not in this house. He was in a different place, a place where he was convinced he was defending himself from an attack that wasn't happening, from an enemy that no one else could see. The illusion of safety did not fade. It shattered. It shattered with the first sharp, brutal crack of a gunshot. The noise was immense, deafening, an explosion that was wrong in every way. It physically punched the air in the small home. It was followed instantly by a new smell, a hot chemical stench of burnt gunpowder that smothered the holiday scent in seconds. Then, another smell, faint at first but growing, the coppery tang of fresh blood. The confusion vanished, replaced by a raw, primal panic. The room exploded into motion. It was a terrible, chaotic sound of screams and overturned furniture. Gary fired on his twin sister, Mary Beth. She fell. The sound of her body hitting the floor and the violent wooden scrape of a chair across the wood was a gruesome, disjointed blend. Her sister, Charlene, let out a terrified, cut-short scream. It was the last sound she ever made. Gary turned the weapon and fired again. Charlene, 7 months pregnant, was killed instantly. 2 lives, twin sisters, wiped out in a single, unthinking moment. He continued moving. The high-pitched, desperate wail of little Wayne, who had been so full of life just moments before, turned into a choking, small sound that suddenly stopped. Frank and Jerry, his older cousin and cousin-in-law, fell moments later, adding to the awful, mounting silence. 5 people were dead on the floor. Wanda, his mother, managed to lurch forward, her hands outstretched. She cried out his name, a desperate, broken sound that was half plea, half command. Gary fired again. The bullet struck her in the throat. The heavy thud of her collapse was followed by a horrific, wet, rasping sound as she fought for a breath the bullet had stolen. The remaining family members scrambled, climbing and crawling over each other, over the wreckage of the dinner to get out. Their own ragged, tearing breaths and the frantic pounding of their hearts in their ears filled the unnatural void in the house. The entire world had muted, shrinking to a place of sudden, impossible isolation. And then, as suddenly as it began, Gary stopped. The gun was lowered, the smoke from the barrel wafting slowly toward the ceiling. He looked down at the wreckage he had made, the blood, the bodies, the ruined Thanksgiving table. When the rising and falling wail of police sirens finally cut through the night, a sound from the outside world breaking into the nightmare, Gary was still standing there. He was staring at the floor, muttering, claiming over and over that he had just been defending himself. But the true horror, the deepest dread, always lingers in the aftermath. Wanda, his mother, survived. It took 8 major surgeries to rebuild what the bullet had destroyed, to keep her alive. She lived, forever carrying the physical and psychological scar of that day. The aftermath was a cold, cruel form of prolonged torture for the survivors. They had to sit in a courtroom in 2010 and again in 2011 and testify against their own family member. They had to confirm Gary's history of violent outbursts, his documented mental health issues, the PTSD that he had brought home with him. Gary's defense was built entirely on his own delusion. He insisted he had simply been protecting himself from an invisible enemy. The court, however, saw only the bloody reality. In the end, Gary was found guilty of 5 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life without parole. Justice, perhaps, but there was no resolution. There was no comfort. The holiday was ruined forever. The family circle permanently broken. Every future gathering, every Thanksgiving, would be defined not by gratitude, but by absence. The memory of that day remains, a permanent stain. The scent of turkey, the sound of laughter, and the awful crushing sound of a bullet erasing all of it. The family was preparing for a peaceful Thanksgiving when their 13-year-old daughter found a mysterious package on the front porch. But when she opened what she thought was an early Christmas gift, it detonated into a nightmare that would kill 3 family members in an instant. It was November 28th, 1987, a Saturday. But in that house, in that family's mind, it was Thanksgiving. They were 2 days late for the holiday, but that didn't matter. The feeling was right. The house, tucked away in rural Mississippi, was full of that comfortable, specific noise that only happens when a home is packed with family. If you were standing in the hallway, you could hear everything. From the den, a small television was playing a football game. It wasn't loud, just a low, steady roar of a crowd, the kind of sound the men used to mark the passing of the afternoon. From the kitchen, the air was heavy. It was the rich, unmistakable smell of a roasting turkey, already hours in. The skin was starting to tighten and pop. You could smell the herbs. Every few minutes, a bright, familiar laugh, a little off-key, would cut through the air. That was Aunt Kathy. You'd hear her laugh, then the immediate sharp clatter of silverware. She was separating the forks and knives, getting the big table ready for the meal. It was the sound of safety, the sound of certainty, the sound of a predictable, happy afternoon. It just goes to show how fast all of it can be ruined. That feeling of safety can be silenced in a single brutal second. Jessica was 13. She was at that age where she was old enough to be helpful, but still young enough to look for surprises, to hope for them. She was walking back from the mailbox at the end of the long gravel drive. It was quiet outside, just the sound of her own feet. She was kicking at the piles of dead leaves that had fallen from the big oak tree. The dry crunch and skitter of the leaves was the only sound. That's when she saw it. It was sitting right on the edge of the front porch, almost hidden by the white wooden rail. It wasn't a box, it was a briefcase. She'd never seen it before. It was a cheap piece of luggage, the kind made of hard, molded plastic, slick and black. The kind of thing a person buys for one trip, and then it lives in the back of a closet. It looked cheap when it was new. It looked sinister when it was left behind. She got closer. She nudged it with her shoe. It was heavy, not a natural heavy like a pile of books or tools. It was a solid, dead, unnatural weight. It felt wrong just to be there. She looked at the handles. They were all scarred up, like the case had been dragged on concrete or pavement. But the latch on the front was different. It was shiny and new. Polished silver metal. There wasn't a single scratch on it. It looked like it had been replaced just for this trip. Jessica's mind, in that innocent way of a 13-year-old, went straight to Christmas. It was only a few weeks away. She figured it was a gift, wrapped up in a strange way and dropped off by accident, or maybe some forgotten heirloom. The kind of thing an adult would leave behind by mistake. She wasn't scared. She didn't think about anything else. She was just curious. She knelt down on the wooden planks of the porch. The smell of the turkey from inside the house was strong, even out here. She put her finger on that shiny, brand new latch. She pushed it. It made a sound. A loud, distinct metal snick. It was a clean, mechanical noise. It cut right through the quiet afternoon air. It sounded final. The lid popped open an inch. She pulled it back. Inside, things weren't right. It wasn't full of documents. It wasn't full of clothes or gifts. It was a bundle of dark metal pipes, thick ones. They were held together with tight wraps of black electrical tape. Wires, red and blue, were crudely connected to a small block. The whole thing sat on a bed of what looked like white foam, cut to fit the shape of the pipes. She didn't know what a pipe bomb was. She was 13, but she knew what a gift was not. It looked less like an item and more like a mistake. She just knelt there looking at it, confused. The sounds from the house still spilled out onto the porch. The distant cheer from the football game, the clatter of plates being stacked. Her father, Joshua, came around the corner from the driveway. He was just back from a quick trip to the general store. Aunt Kathy had forgotten an ingredient for one of the pies. He was in a good mood, happy to be back. He clapped his hands together once. A big, loud, happy clap. The sound of, "I'm home." That's when he spotted Jessica. He saw her. He saw her kneeling on the porch. He saw the strange open case in front of her. His smile vanished. That happy clap was the last conscious sound he would ever make. He took one single, fast step toward her. He must have opened his mouth to yell, to tell her to run. In that half second, in that tiny sliver of time, the world stopped. All the comforting sounds of home, the TV, Aunt Kathy's laugh, the plates, they all just stopped. They were sucked out of the air. The only sound left in that final, terrible silence was a tiny, high-pitched tick. A sound of plastic and cheap metal, right by Jessica's ear. Then came the detonation. It wasn't a movie bomb. It was a violent, crushing thump. A sound that shattered the air itself. It was the sound of the house fighting back the sound of wood and steel, protesting right before they were torn apart. The crack of studs and the screech of nails ripping free. In an instant, the explosion consumed the entire entrance to the house. The force didn't travel out like a fire. It traveled in. It was a brutal physical wave of air, metal shrapnel and pulverized plaster. Joshua was standing closest. He was struck by the main force and killed instantly. Jessica, who had been kneeling right over the case, was gone in the same moment. Her visiting cousin, Ryan, was 21. He was in town just for the dinner. He had been walking down the hall, coming to the front door to greet Joshua. He was caught in the worst of the force. He was killed instantly, right where he stood. A fourth family member further back in the house was caught by the secondary wave of shrapnel and trauma. They were rushed to the hospital, but they died from their injuries. 1 second, the house smelled like roasting turkey and spiced pumpkin pie. The next, those smells were gone. They were instantly replaced by an acrid, chemical, sickening scent, the hot, stinging smell of burned copper and sulfur. The story should have ended right there. It should have been a story of a horrible, tragic crime and its victims. But it wasn't. The true terror of this event, the part that sticks in your gut, is in the aftermath. The part that came next. The police came. The sound of sirens filled the air for miles. The neighborhood was sealed off. Investigators in heavy vests started the slow job of walking through the wreckage. They gathered the physical evidence. They found the twisted remains of the black plastic briefcase. They found the fragments of the dark metal pipes. They found the battery, the timer, and the pieces of a remote detonation device. It was a professional hit, clear as day. But it was not meant for this family. It was not meant for Joshua or Jessica or Ryan. This family in this house was just preparing a peaceful late Thanksgiving dinner. They were collateral damage. The pipe bomb, wrapped in a cheap black case, was delivered to the wrong house. The family, the innocent victims, were just a catastrophic, simple case of mistaken identity. The real target lived 1 street over. The investigation dragged on. The family was broken and the town was scared. 2 years later, in 2011, the police got a conviction. A man named Andrew. The case was weak. It was built on shaky testimony and circumstantial evidence. There was no real physical proof. But the town wanted someone to blame. They needed someone to be responsible. Andrew sat in a prison cell. 8 years went by. Then, in 1997, the whole thing was overturned. A judge looked at new evidence. This new evidence proved, without a doubt, that someone else was the real target. It proved Andrew couldn't have done it. He was cleared. His conviction was thrown out. The court officially acknowledged that someone else was responsible. Someone else built that bomb. Someone else drove it to that street and left it on a porch. But that's where the facts stop. The real perpetrator, the person who did this, was never identified. They were never caught. The case is still open. Officially, to this day, it remains unsolved. Someone got away with it. You know what's haunting? When you really think about it, the most haunting part isn't the bomb or the wreckage. It's what didn't get used. Outside the house, on the lawn, the folding chairs for the Thanksgiving meal were still set up. The ones Ryan and Joshua would have been sitting in. They were set up perfectly on the grass, waiting for the family to come outside. Through all the chaos, the sounds of the sirens, the investigation, they just sat there. They waited all night. A handful of empty chairs, sitting there in the dark, perfectly fine, untouched. They were the proof. The proof that the only thing that had really been destroyed that day was the family's certainty, their belief that they were safe inside their own home. The family was just 2 days late for a holiday. The bomb was just 1 house over from its target. All that separated a normal, predictable Thanksgiving and a horrific, unsolved massacre was a single wrong street number. It's always the smallest things, isn't it? The smallest, stupidest things that make the biggest difference.